What's up, everybody? I am here with Ti Windisch of the Gyrostep Podcast and GSN. Ti, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Gerald. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. A lot of people don't know this, but Ti and I used to work together way back in the day, back in our fan-sided Hoops Have It days. So I'm really glad to have him on and get the Bucks perspective of the Budenholzer hire. So Ti, let's just start off right off the bat. What should Suns fans who aren't as familiar with Bud know about him?
They should know they're not going to glean much information from his interviews. I think that is the number one thing. I think I'm going to be watching. Have they scheduled the intro presser yet?
Not yet. Hopefully it should be sometime within the next week. Yeah.
I can't wait. My favorite Budenholzerism, he says, a lot, but I think my favorite is once they asked him what he likes out there. It might have been preseason, like real early with the Bucks group. And what do you like out there, bud? And he's like, well, they're getting up, they're playing 5-on-5. It's like, yeah, that's literally every game. Like he is, I don't know if maybe it was just a Bucks thing, maybe it'll be different in Phoenix, but he is very close to the vest on what he will say. You really have to watch and pay attention to what goes on out there with Bud. I mean, he'll talk about players and praise them and stuff. I will say one of the positives is certainly not a coach who would ever throw a player under the bus. I think like fiercely loyal to make sure he's not going to do anything like that. A lot different in that regard than the Bucks' current coach, Doc Rivers. But Bud is, I think he is resilient to his own schemes. Like he has a way of doing things, which we'll get into, that he really likes to stick to, and he is not very talkative. So those would be like my super broad level Bud things to expect for Suns fans.
Okay, so some good and some bad in there for me, the guy who likes to ask very thoughtful and detailed questions.
If you focus on scheme, maybe you'll get something, but he, you gotta get a little lucky, I think, too. He a man of few words during his interviews.
Okay, so we'll see how that goes. But I did want to get your thoughts on the fit here, because one thing that I've been hearing a lot is that, and you look at his teams of the past as well, you mentioned this, that he has a certain way that he likes to play, probably on both ends of the floor. We know with this PHNX Suns team, like they were very 3-point resistant. They have 3 mid-range gunners, 3 mid-range maestros, and Bud's teams have always ranked, bottom 5, bottom 10 in the league in their frequency of shots from that range. There's also the accountability side of things in terms of that might be part of why Frank Vogel was let go, struggling to keep those 3 big names accountable. So I'm curious your thoughts on what to expect from Bud in that regard, in terms of his fit here, liking to play one way that might be run a little counter to what his stars like. And then the accountability side of things, like, is that going to be a clash, or is that kind of what this Suns team needs at this point?
I think it's certainly what they need. I don't know. It could still be a clash. I think toward the end of the Budenholzer tenure in Milwaukee, it's so tough to judge, right? Because he's really in Atlanta, had no true superstar. And in Milwaukee had Giannis, who it seems like is one of the easier stars to deal with for a head coach, right? I mean, he was defending Jason Kidd out of the door. He defended Bud the whole time. He was on Adrian Griffin's team until that was untenable, and now he seems like a Doc fan. So I think you'd have to be really bad for Giannis to be like out on you as a coach. I think the team kind of fell in line with that. Although I will say at the end, there were players like Jay Crowder, Bobby Portis, who had some comments about maybe the culture or the connection with Bud by the end. So I do think that's something that going into this job will probably be on his mind a lot, in terms of, I need to make sure I'm forging these relationships with these star players. Where it will get interesting, I think, is the offensive end. I just looked before we started this. The Bucks under Bud, the lowest they ever were 8th in 3-point frequency per game, just raw threes per game. And they were top 5 every other season. They were never first, but they were always 2nd through 5th, except for one year. I do think so. He has these boxes on the floor that he will probably put up, or at least did with the Bucks during like camp, basically, to let everyone know this is where you should be. I think it'll be a little different because, of course, he built that offense around Giannis, and there's no Giannis. So again, it's hard to do one-to-one parallels unless he had taken a job in New Orleans, in which case I think he probably would have used the exact same setup. But I think in Phoenix, he may do something similar because there's still a lot of immense scoring gravity from these 3 guys, right? It's just in a different place. But I will imagine like Bud's idea of great offense is there's one action that's pulling toward the rim and opening up space around the rim. The dunker spot he really adapted, and that became a hallmark of the Bucks too. but he's going to want the floor more space. So I do think that's going to be one of the things to watch is like, let's say one of Bradley Beal or Devin Booker is not in the action. Bud's going to want those guys out in the corner or above the break, certainly, where they're able to shoot, and same for KD. So it's going to be really interesting to see, like, there's not the one obvious guy like Giannis. I mean, the Bucks had great players around him. There was always, and of course, Bud never coached Dame there. There was always like a clear delineation. Like it's the Giannis machine and everyone fits in. It's not really like that, which almost gives you some more freedom, but less structure. So I'm really interested to see how he builds it. But I do think he's going to demand more 3-point shots overall from the Suns, not just from their role players. And like that push and pull is probably going to be one of the most interesting things to watch early in his tenure of just, okay, how many threes are they actually shooting? Are they bought in? Are they doing it or are they not? Because I do think he's not a mid-range guy. Like he'll concede mid-range on defense. Chris Middleton had to kind of fight to be able to take those mid-rangers early. They had a conflict in the first year. It's true. Like Bud was like, no, don't take those. And Chris was like, hey man, this is part of my game. I need to do this. So I think he obviously going in is going to know that these three players are going to do that, but he will also be like, hey, I'll let you do some of that, but you got to take some threes too.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see how that dynamic shakes out because everybody's focusing on the off court, accountability, leadership, all this stuff. But I think on the court, in terms of playing styles, that's where I'm going to be looking more often to see if they're able to kind of find that compromise, that happy middle ground. Because you're right, like Bud's teams have historically played at a faster pace than the Suns have recently. They've gotten up a lot more threes. But I am curious if you had one area of concern for this hire. Like I think Bud was probably the best coach that they could have possibly landed on the open market in terms of his experience tailoring his system in multiple places, getting winning seasons, winning a championship. But if you had to point to one area where you're going to be keeping an eye on of concern, other than maybe the 3-point thing, what would that be?
I think I have one for both ends. So offensively, I think it's Bud's philosophy with the Bucks at least was play random, which I
Mm-hmm.
think worked out. And I think the players liked it for the most part. Where they had like he doesn't call sets as much in like flowing half court offense. Funny thing is, people always say Bud can't. Dumb people always say Bud can't call plays. His ATOs always rank toward the top of the league. I think you're going to see some beautiful ATOs. But in like, rebound, bring the ball up the court, he's not one to call sets very often. He likes to instill concepts and let the players decide. And while I think that can really work, and if the 3-point thing and everything catches on, it might be great. I did think for this Suns job, someone who maybe runs a little bit more rigid offense might be necessary because you saw too many possessions where it was like, okay, someone's isolating, right? It's another isolation. We're not
Mm-hmm.
using these three players enough together. So I think striking that balance is going to be crucial on offense of, let's just not let guys take the shots they want. Let's make sure we're working a little better. I think the Bucks offense in the playoffs under Bud, a lot of bad shots, a lot of shots that weren't ideal, a lot of Drew Holiday pull-ups, right? Like the kind of stuff you don't want to see when you have Giannis and Chris Middleton on the floor. So I think that's going to be a big thing. And then defensively, I just look at who's probably starting for them, assuming it probably Grayson has a good shot, Bud guy there. If he's going to drop, and we'll see what he does, but if he's going to drop, who is going to be that screen navigator? Who is going to be the Eric Bledsoe, Drew Holiday role? Because you don't really see, with the 3 stars and Grayson Allen and, Royce O'Neal or whoever, a player who you're like, oh yeah, that guy can get across the screen and stay with it and take away the middies. So I'm really interested to see all of the defense, but especially to see, like, do they find a screen navigator? Can they keep a Kogi? Can he do that? But that was a hallmark of the Bud defense, and I don't see maybe a Kogi, but outside of him, a great fit for that role.
Yeah, and the Kogi, like he's great defensively. He can navigate those screens, but offensively, is he playable? That's always been the question with him.
Yeah,
I am curious. I wanted to get your thoughts on what to expect from a Mike Budenholzer defense. Obviously, this kind of depends on personnel, and the Suns are different from the Bucks in that respect. But anything that you saw from your time in Milwaukee or his time in Milwaukee that you can point to, like, yeah, you could probably look for this in Phoenix too.
I mean, I think they'll want to do a base drop, and I actually think part of the personnel works. Like I think Nurkic can probably do a reasonable job at that. I know his
Mhm.
numbers within 6 feet of the rim were actually really strong this season. He
Mhm.
contested a lot of shots there and held opponents to a low percentage. So I'm not laughing at that concept like many are. The other thing that I think makes it make sense to me is Durant is such a good defender and underrated and has such a frame that I think Bud could probably take some of the concepts that they use defensively with Lopez and Giannis and apply them. and do a good job taking away the painted area. And I think that's the Bud specialty on defense. He'll always give up mid-rangers, which can bite you against some opponents. Sometimes the threes too. But his defense is he really works to take away the rim, because I think it's a good philosophy. If you're not consistently getting to the rim, it's hard to sustain good offense through a whole game or through a whole series. But again, the question is, how do you guard the perimeter if you're dropping and giving up that space? So, he started to switch more later with his Bucks tenure. For like the first 2 years, it was really just all drop, and teams were able to take advantage. When they added Holiday and they kind of, some players like PJ Tucker played a big role in Drew and saying like, we need to be more adaptable. They started to switch a little bit more, but he likes to have a certain set defense, or at least did in Milwaukee. So I would guess it will be dropped. But again, I'm very interested to see the modifications, because of course, Giannis was pretty important to the drop too. Even though he wasn't the drop big, he was the big helper. So I think Durant can do some of that. Obviously, you don't want him working as hard as Giannis was in his early Bud years in Milwaukee. But I'd be fascinated to see, like, does he just switch from the jump? Because that has not been a Bud thing at all, but maybe he has to with this group.
Last question for you, Ty, and I think I can kind of glean your answer based on your responses so far. But if you're looking at this Suns roster in terms of what a Budenholzer system could use the most of, like everyone keeps talking about the Suns need a point guard, the Suns need a point guard. They have 3 lead offensive initiators. But I am curious, like, do you think the Suns team, they have very limited means to get these things, by the way, but in terms of like a wing stopper or a ball screen navigator or just a 3-point shooter, like what kind of stands out to you in terms of, Bud would really be cooking if the Suns were able to add this type of player over the summer?
Yeah, I think they're good on shooting. I mean, I think with their 3 players, and then Allen will be around, we assume, unless he is traded. But assuming he's around, I think, he obviously comfortable in a Bud scheme, knows what to do, and just knows how to play with these 3 guys too. So I think he'll have a big role. I think it is just a defender, a perimeter defender, a navigator of sorts. I mean, a wing stopper works too, whatever it may be. But I do assume Bud's going to want to drop. I think he's going to look at Nurkic and see, I think this guy can help. He's a big physical defender, right? You're not going to, if he's got that advantage in the drop, he's going to be able to wall off the rim pretty well. But you need to be locked in and committed, and you need to be able to navigate screens. I think there's going to be just more impetus too on, Beal, Booker, these guys of like, you got to do it some as well. I mean, no one's expecting Bradley Beal to be Drew Holiday or Eric Bledsoe defensively, who's an all defensive player, but I would expect that there's going to be more drop coverage, and I would expect that they'll probably target with these vet minimums or draft picks or whatever resources Phoenix does have, players who profile as being able to do that, whether it's a veteran, whether it's a younger player, but just someone who's quick, can navigate screens, and stick with those offensive players. So a mid-ranger contested from the rear or side, not that bad to give up. Wide open ones, they can add up in a hurry, especially if then help is coming and threes are opened up. You can tell I've lived through this several years in a row. So I think that screen navigation, perimeter defense is going to be the number one thing they need.
Absolutely. Suns fans, his name is Ti Windisch. You can follow him on Twitter at Ti Windisch. If you're interested in the Bucks perspective, make sure to go check out the Gyrostep podcast they have. It's one of the best podcast names that I've seen with the double entendre. So I love that, Ty. Thank you so much for hopping on.
Thank you. I always say when the content's as good as the name, we'll be rolling, but appreciate you having me on, Gerald.